So recently I was talking about the US F1 team and how they never made the Formula 1 grid in 2010 simply because they weren't advancing in the manner that they should have been advancing. But had they actually made the grid in 2010 along with the other three teams, we would have been back up to the magical number of 26, the maximum amount of cars that can start a Grand Prix. But as it was, US F1 never made it, and instead we got the three teams that we came to know, love and meme. Out of the three, Virgin, Marussia, Manor, whatever you want to call them, lasted the longest. HRT was the first to fall, but there was also a return of British Racing Green and a long lost name in Lotus. The story of how all three came and went has been done, so why not go into some details on how Lotus, later Caterham, actually went under? Because as far as I can tell, they are the only team to make a Grand Prix thanks to crowdfunding. Now, Caterham being on the grid to start with was pretty admirable, given that they weren't given a slot on the grid until the September of 2009. But since they had the foresight to go, we might actually make the grid, they started doing stuff anyway, just in case. Similar to what Andretti is doing right now, despite not having a slot for 2025, and still no guarantee of a slot for 2028. Although the whole carnage behind the scenes at Andretti might be something for whoever starts doing these videos 10 or 15 years from now. Because it probably won't be me. I'll be living in Kelowna, British Columbia, because I'll have won the Euro Millions. In my mind. But anyway, Lotus was going to be on the grid. And they were on the grid because Lightspeed, which was racing in Formula 3 at the time, had teamed up with Tony Fernandez, who was the owner of Air Asia and the Asian equivalent of Alan Sugar on their version of The Apprentice. Well, the first season of it anyway. Lightspeed had basically teamed up with Fernandez to bring the Lotus name back onto a Formula 1 grid. And Fernandez, in coalition with a bunch of Malaysian businesses and also some backing from the Malaysian government, got the Lotus name back on the grid because the Malaysian car company Proton owned Lotus at the time. Core memory unlocked. The Proton Wira rally car. The way the investment worked is that the Malaysian government put money in through Proton instead of doing it themselves, which is probably the best way of doing it. You don't want the public complaining that their taxes have been spent on a Formula 1 car. It's not the most mental way of spending taxpayers' money because my grandparents' tax money was spent on a supersonic aircraft, so there's different levels to this kind of thing. But because the Malaysian government owned Proton, which then owned Lotus, that's how they managed to bring the Lotus name back onto the grid. The only thing that they wanted to do was make the name proud. There's a lot of history behind the name Lotus. The legends of Graham Hill, Jim Clark, Jochen Rindt, Emerson Fittipaldi, Mario Andretti, Ronnie Peterson, Ayrton Senna and Nigel Mansell, among others, were all associated with the original Team Lotus that ran from the late 50s all the way up until 1994. And part of the reason they were able to make it on the grid in such a short space of time is that leading the design aspect of the car was Mike Gascoigne, formerly of Toyota, McLaren, Sauber, Tyrrell, Renault and Jordan. Gascoigne was the man who designed the 1999 Jordan car, so he knew how to work with limited funds and facilities. And in the car they had two race-winning drivers, Jarno Trulli and Heikki Kovalainen. Not exactly the most successful Formula 1 drivers of all time, but they were certainly experienced. But despite having the late acceptance onto the grid and having the car being built while the factory was still being put together, the cars were able to be competitive with the other teams, but they were still miles off the mid-pack. Unlike the Virgins, both cars made the end, although it was a technicality because Trulli had retired late on but got classified because he'd finished 90% of the Grand Prix. Kovalainen, meanwhile, finished 15th and was 2 laps down on Alonso, who won the race. Sounds mental today that a car could finish that far down, but back then it was quite respectable. In Australia though, Kovalainen managed to finish 13th, but there was one small issue with the car. It was repeatedly having issues with, well, the same thing mostly. In Melbourne, Trulli never started due to hydraulic issues on the way to the grid, as well as having an issue in qualifying that meant he was bouncing around in his seat. At the home race in Malaysia, Kovalainen had issues with his hydraulics and lost 9 laps. Trulli also lost time with hydraulic issues, and this was a race where Lotus had made the second qualifying session with Heikki due to correctly gambling on the weather. In Spain, more hydraulic issues that prevented Kovalainen from starting the race, but by this point, the Lotus was clearly the faster of the 3 new teams. In Turkey, more hydraulic problems, and the same thing happened in Singapore for Trulli, while Kovalainen's car burst into flames. Really, success for the 3 new teams depended on who would get the highest finishing position because points were going to be hard to come by, if not impossible. As it was, Lotus finished 12th and 13th in Japan, which was enough for them to finish ahead of the other 2 new teams and get the prize money for 10th. As the result of a bet between Fernandez and Richard Branson, because 2 of the teams had a battle of the airlines, Branson had to spend a day on an Air Asia flight dressed as a female flight attendant, but this didn't go ahead until 2013. Moving into 2011 though, Lotus was now using Renault engines and was also buying gearboxes from Red Bull because they were sick and tired of having the Cosworth and X-Track combination break down on them. The team was also looking to expand and had hired some ex-Force India engineers as well as looking to build their own wind tunnel at their base. With a new car and some ambition, it might actually be that Lotus would make their way forward, and they still had their drivers from the year before. But there was a small problem that year, and that was the case surrounding the team name. Basically, the Renault team was also called Lotus, as Renault was being sponsored by the car company, who wanted to have their name associated with a more successful team. While the Lotus group had given Fernandez permission to use the Lotus name, the team being called Lotus Racing in 2010, they didn't have the rights to the name Team Lotus, those rights now being in the hands of David Hunt, James's brother. Fernandez then bought a license to use Team Lotus from David, and the team was going to be called Team Lotus for 2011. After some back and forth and back, and some more back and forth, the case ended up going to the High Court in London, where a judge ruled that Fernandez Team Lotus, as it was now called due to the license that they bought from Hunt, could continue to operate as such, using the old Team Lotus logo and the actual name, Team Lotus. But the team couldn't be called Lotus on its own, since the Lotus group, which was sponsoring the Renault team, now had the rights. But even though that was the outcome, the reason they were there in the first place was to try and figure out whether Lotus had wrongly terminated that original license agreement or not. The whole thing was just so confusing. So for the 2011 season, we had the unique situation of two teams being called the same thing almost. Yeah, okay, there's Toro Rosso and Red Bull, with one name just being the Italian way of saying the other, but to make it even more mental is that one team was running the green and yellow of one era of Lotus, and the other was running the other iconic colours of Lotus, the black and gold John Player special colours. But it has to be said that the Chapman family had made a statement saying that they would rather not have the Team Lotus name back on the grid. To make matters even more confusing, Gerard Lopez of Jenny Capital had bought into Group Lotus with the vision to take over Lotus Cars, and Jenny had also bought the Renault team completely by this point. But the team was still called Renault in the same way that it was still BMW Sauber in 2010. Something to do with the Concorde agreement. It broke my brain going through all of this, but at the same time, maybe just as a contingency plan when it came to naming things, Fernandez had bought the Caterham car company. But the new car wasn't as good as the team was hoping. It was still faster than the other two teams, but it was still a good way off challenging the likes of Toro Rosso, Force India and Williams. The best result was the same as it was in 2010, a 13th place, which went to Trulli at Monaco, and then Kovalainen at Monza. But even though they were motivated to beat the other Lotus team on the grid, they were never anywhere near getting close. They were basically the racing equivalent of Italy in the Six Nations or Norwich City in English football, who, coincidentally, have green and yellow as their kit colours and are also from Norfolk, like Lotus. They were too good for one league, but too terrible to compete with those above them. If you were to tier list the teams of that year, you had Red Bull, McLaren and Ferrari, then Mercedes, Lotus, Force India, Williams, Sauber and Toro Rosso, then the Green Lotuses, and then HRT and Marussia. The Green Lotuses were basically sitting in this competitive no man's land in between Toro Rosso and Virgin. It's a bit like when I'm playing Stellaris away from doing these videos. I'm too good to play on the Commodore difficulty setting, but I'm not good enough to play on Admiral. Stellaris is fun, especially when you're playing the Star Trek mod. But for 2012, the team would be rebranded to Caterham, and the reason for this was simple. Part of the judgment from the High Court was that Lotus Group had first preference on calling something Lotus. The Renault constructor was going to be rebranded Lotus for 2012, with Kimi Räikkönen and Romain Grosjean driving those cars, so Fernandez rebranded to Caterham as the Lotus Group had bought the rights to Team Lotus to avoid a massive carnage fest with the naming rights in the future. So with the new name and keeping the Renault engines, oh yeah, that was something else, they were both going to be Lotus Renaults, they set about the 2012 season. Trulli and Kovalainen kept their seats, which seemed to be a good decision, but then before the season got going, the team announced that Vitaly Petrov would be racing instead. Now this wasn't one of these pay driver taking the job away from a guy with talent sort of thing. Trulli had become disillusioned with the lack of progress and asked to be replaced. And it was a case of turbo irony because Petrov had come in from the other Lotus team and had also managed to bag a podium during that season on his way to finishing 10th in the standings. The 2012 car wasn't much of an upgrade on the previous year's car. It was once again slower than Caterham had anticipated, and this was at the same time the team had moved into the old Arrows base in Leafield in Oxfordshire. Once again, the best the team could manage was 13th over the course of the season, with the team's day of days being in the Bahrain Grand Prix, where Hecke had made it into the second qualifying session at the expense of Schumacher. And the car made Q2, and God knows I dislike these abbreviations, a handful of times over the course of the season. They were still the best of the three new teams though, but that was to be expected at this point. And staying on the subject of these abbreviations, at the US Grand Prix recently I heard the term SQ2 and thought they were playing Vauxhall's Revenge. That's a niche one, and if you do get it, a Jaffa cake goes in your direction. But this is where things were going to take a sharp turn in fortunes for the team. Kovalainen and Petrov were going to be kicked aside for 2 new drivers called Charles Pic and Guido van der Garde, a sharp downgrade on the previous 2 drivers. There was also the demise of the HRT team that would have made the other 2 teams start to look over their shoulders, as it was clear that being near the bottom of the pile every year wasn't a good look for any sponsors in the increasingly expensive world of Formula 1, and Caterham and Marussia were going to have to get either a miracle or resort to pay drivers, because the prize money wasn't contributing much. Marussia meanwhile had been given a bit of a boost because they had a weapon that Caterham simply didn't have: Jules Bianchi. They also had Max Chilton, who went through 2013 without a single retirement, which I think is a record for a rookie. Fernandez's patience with the team was also starting to wear thin. In 2011 he'd bought out Bernie Eccleston's shares in Queen's Park Rangers Football Club, and the club had managed to survive the 2011-2012 Premier League season, staying up on the final day despite Joey Barton doing Joey Barton things against Man City. But the 2012-2013 season was going badly, and they'd be relegated at the end of that season. So now his focus was on getting QPR back to the Premier League, and while the on-pitch performances weren't great, the vibe around the club seemed to be better at a community level. Apparently. Despite being the best of the 3 new teams in 2010, 11 and 12, Caterham would be bottom of the pile in 2013. Marussia had managed to overtake them thanks to Bianchi's 13th in Malaysia, where he'd finished ahead of Guido and Charles. Needless to say, both Caterham drivers were gone at the end of the year, and replaced by rookie Marcus Ericsson, who brought some funds, and veteran Kamui Kobayashi. But when the car is as fast as Continental drift and handles like a canal boat, nobody, and I mean nobody, so not Schumacher, Hamilton, Verstappen, Lauda, Clark, Prost, Senna, Piquet, whoever, are getting points in that thing. The Caterham of 2014 was an absolute dog, although the nose cone was closer to dong rather than dog, and the sponsors, including Airbus and General Electric, weren't particularly keen on hanging around. At the same time, Caterham/Lotus became the team to have the longest run in F1 history without points, as Bianchi managed to score at Monaco and thus get Marussia off the mark. A miracle would need to happen if Caterham was going to stay alive. But they didn't get one. Airbus and General Electric had disappeared by the time the British Grand Prix came around, leaving just Ericsson's sponsors on the car. Andre Lotterer came in for the Belgian Grand Prix, and then Kobayashi didn't start in Singapore thanks to an oil leak or fuel pressure issue, one of the two, but by this point, Fernandez had sold to some new investors, which involved Colin Colles coming back into Formula 1 briefly. In the October of 2014, bailiffs entered the Leafield factory and seized assets to cover unpaid debts, although I'm a bit confused as to who those debts were owed to. But either way, the debts totaled 15 million British pounds, and the administrators were called in. Basically, administration for those outside of the UK is where you appoint somebody to look after the business and try and help manage the debts, whether that's selling bits and pieces of the company off to help pay for those debts, or selling the company off entirely and, finding a buyer. One of the administrators, an Irishman by the name of Finbar O'Connell, ended up being the team principal. Somehow. Even though the company running Caterham F1 was registered elsewhere, the actual team was being run out of the UK, so it was a matter for the UK courts. Even more bizarrely, when Carles couldn't find a buyer for the team, an ex-Romanian footballer by the name of Constantin Cojocaru ended up becoming the owner of the team. Somehow, like the shares were transferred to him or something along those lines. Yeah, it's incredibly complicated, and I'm not really going to go into much more detail because it's a legal thing and I don't want to get it wrong and potentially get into trouble. But I'll leave a link to an interview with Finbar O'Connell that you can read at your leisure. But from what I gather, the whole thing was because there was just this huge debate as to who actually owned the F1 team. Like, was it still Fernandez? Was it these new investors? Was it this ex-Romanian footballer who was working as a cleaner? It just didn't make sense as to who was owning what with regards to the company. Forbes wrote that when the team collapsed, the team had been sold to these new investors and everything had apparently gone through. But because of who owned what and which group or company was where, it meant that Caterham basically sat in the middle with no bills being paid. The biggest bill was something in the region of about $12 million, and the smallest bill was about $650 or thereabouts. Bernie then told the Sun newspaper that it's better that Caterham went because people going around with begging bowls isn't good for business. Meanwhile, Fernandez was adamant that he didn't own the team anymore, and the Formula 1 team was nothing to do with Caterham Cars, which he still owned, and that the Caterham Formula 1 team was now using his business's name under license, with estimates from Forbes being that once the whole thing went under, that the Formula 1 team owed the Caterham Car Company something in the region of about 15 million quid. Again, it's all very confusing, so take everything I've said with a pinch of salt. O'Connell found that nobody was getting paid, not just the suppliers, but the staff weren't being paid either, and O'Connell felt bad for the team given that they all seemed to live and breathe racing and it was all going up the Swanee for them. But through the power of crowdfunding, mostly because the fans wanted Kobayashi back on the grid, Caterham was offered one final lifeline. Bernie had given them special dispensation to miss 2 rounds of the season in Austin and Sao Paulo, because Caterham was going to finish last anyway and it was so close to the end of the season it didn't really matter. But with Ericsson now bound for Sauber, it meant that they needed one more driver to get them back onto the grid, so they got Will Stevens in, who would race for Manor the following year as they too were in the deep, this not including the fatal injuries that Bianchi had sustained in Japan. Stevens and Kobayashi turned up for the final round in Abu Dhabi, but it went with a whimper. They were safe from being at the back of the grid due to Vettel and Ricciardo being excluded from qualifying, this due to being because of an illegal front wing or something, but they were still 3 to 3.5 seconds off Hamilton's Q1 time. Stevens finished a lap down, which isn't too bad considering, but then Hamilton had slowed down after Rosberg had his engine issues and Kobayashi retired with a vibration about 10 laps from the end. So the Caterham team went with, well, a whimper. They could not be rescued for the 2015 season, but it probably wouldn't have been sustainable for much longer. Manor survived with buyouts and the prize money, but with the way costs were shooting up in the hybrid era, there's not much that Caterham probably could have done. They had debts even with Pirelli, and it seems that it all kick-started with Fernandez selling up, but it's hard to pinpoint it exactly. They also joined the grid with the understanding that there would be a cost cap in place, but that never happened, so to get anywhere near Toro Rosso and Sauber, they would have had to have spent money they simply did not have. To say it's simply just bad business decisions and things like that isn't really a fair assessment. It was a nice idea to bring back a classic team and at least try to bring them forward, and the upgrades to the team for the 2011 season seemed to be a step in the right direction. But while Fernandez had an airline and other businesses that could have helped put money into the team, it was also a case of no cost cap, meaning that Caterham, much like HRT and Manor, was simply outspent, with no hope in hell of ever competing with that. So really, they were doomed before they'd even turned a wheel. Which is a shame because it meant that Lotus was back. We had an old name back on the grid, and yeah, there was a little bit of nostalgia there. Put simply, Caterham, much like HRT and Manor, were just proof that the days of operating a team on a shoestring budget like Minardi or Jordan or Tyrrell before them were quite simply over, especially with the hybrid era beginning. Because now, if you want to be in Formula 1, you need bank, and lots of it. So then, a look at the downfall of the Lotus Formula 1 team and how all that came about. If this has been something new for you and you've learned something here today, do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you do want to help support me at a more personal level, there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, my affiliates and other bits and bobs that you might want or need to know. And of course, there's also memberships if you want to join in a Patreon-style manner without actually doing Patreon. And there's also super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.